Rachel Sabates-Wheeler from IDS.
Okay, thank you. Can you give me a 5-minute warning as well?
Will do.
Thank you. Okay, right, so thanks. This guidance note that I've written was co-authored with Daniel Longhurst, that some of you will know, but unfortunately he couldn't come. Both of us couldn't come. I drew the short straw, but we both really enjoyed writing it. We really enjoyed reading the case studies as well. And it was the only note that has also been co-financed by Irish Aid, so I should at least say that. Okay, let me get. So essentially this note, we were asked to look at different benefit modalities and what are some of the issues and constraints and opportunities we can think about in terms of the type of benefit, the form it's given in context of this humanitarian development nexus. Okay, so the aims of the note were essentially to say how do different modalities, how are they used as part of the social protection approach. The note was designed to be quite short and practical and field focused. So we hope we've provided a think piece for people to look at. And it's certainly not designed to be a how-to. So there's no, we do look at details, we do look at case studies where things have worked, where things haven't worked, but we haven't said this is how you do X, Y, Z in this specific context. And because it's a relatively new area, looking at social protection and modalities within this nexus, there's limited work to draw on, but we hope we've drawn on enough. Okay, so in terms of the terminology first, so when we talk about a benefit modality, we have an annex in the paper that looks at a whole range of the different modalities, starting from cash, vouchers, in-kind transfers, whether it's food or assets, could be agricultural seed packages. We also refer to service provision to an extent, because some of the comments we got back on our first note, people wanted us to include services as a modality. But when we looked at all the case studies, when we reviewed them, in fact, most of the examples were cash. So it is heavily biased towards cash, unfortunately. We do talk about food, we do talk about school feeding and other things, but most of the review is about cash. And in terms of terminology, within social protection arenas, we talk about cash transfers, conditional, unconditional. But of course, in humanitarian settings, there's a bunch of other terms, cash-based transfers, all sorts of different terms we've reviewed in the annex. But for the purpose of this, we're mainly saying cash transfers. But I will say that I personally take the view that social protection has to be predictable, and it has to be over a certain period of time. So if you are to come to someone who's in need of support and you give them a one-off handout, that's it, we're off, I personally don't class that as social protection. But that doesn't mean you all don't, okay, because that's actually a discussion. So it has to be predictable and timely, and social protection in itself has to provide some sense of a safety net and insurance for period 2 or period 3, right? So it's underwriting your risk. So if you only have a one-off handout, that is not fundamentally the basis of what social protection is, but we can discuss that. So that was one in terms of the modality. The nexus, how did we think about nexus? So if you look at the word nexus in the English Oxford Dictionary, it talks about a bond or a juncture or a connection of things and a state of being connected. And of course, we're talking about the humanitarian development connection, particularly in the context of fragility for this work. But of course, there's also literature that talks about a continuum, humanitarian development continuum, and I've worked on that as well. And it's a little bit different, actually, because within the context of these notes, we're talking about what's going on in these fragile humanitarian type emergency contexts, and how do we think about that nexus between long-term social protection, chronic types of poverty versus acute types of poverty, and how do we program? So we did use the terms that OPM and ODI have developed around shock responsive, although not everybody likes that term, but we quite liked it. So we went with shock responsive social protection. But we also recognize that shock responsive social protection, sometimes it's a bit of a misnomer to talk about shock responsive social protection, because you might be in a context where there's zero social protection in the first place. You might be in a shattered systems, shattered democracy, no institutions. And to say shock responsive social protection for some people is like, well, wait a minute, we haven't even got social protection up and running for, you know, the generally chronically long-term poor. So we can't really build on a bit more on shock responsive as well. So we do look at the different contexts of social protection. And we build on the work from the SPIAC-B group that was developed. I also work with FAO and WFP quite a lot, helping them develop their frameworks or policy documents on the humanitarian social protection linkage. So we tried, and I think quite a lot of you are familiar with those social protection contexts, starting from like a very shattered type of system, going through up to a much more stronger, stable, like idealistic, purely responsive system that sort of flexes up and down whenever anyone needs support. And depending on the context you're in, obviously different approaches will be more or less useful. And also this comes down to the benefit modality too. Depending on the context you're going into, will also affect the type of benefit, whether it's food, cash, vouchers, that you provide. So we do have quite a lot of discussion around that shock responsive social protection term. So the main social protection instruments that people always talk about are social assistance, which is non-contributory usually. Might be from a donor, might be from the tax man, but you haven't necessarily contributed. Or you can think about social insurance, which you've contributed to, like my pension, or you can think about active labour market policies. But in this note, we pretty much focus on social assistance, whether it's through humanitarian or social protection arenas. Okay, so I'm going to talk through some of the issues that we raise, looking at the case studies, but also looking at the other literature on the subject, picking out 6 areas that we go through in detail in the note. So first of all, the modality choice. So how do you choose what kind of benefit you might give? So the benefit modality, whether it's cash or food, obviously is highly linked to a delivery mechanism. So if you're going to give cash, you need some way of giving that cash, whether it's through e-payments or bank transfers or driving cash out to areas. Or if it's food, you need the whole logistical support around food, whatever it is. So the modality choice is going to depend on a whole range of factors when you come into a context of fragility or vulnerability. Are markets available? Are food markets available? Is food available on the market? If it's not, maybe you should give food. I mean, if markets are available, should you give cash? What about security? Are there huge security concerns if you're going to deliver cash? What about conditionality? Donors often come in with conditions on what they have to provide. We've only got food, we can only give food, or we've only got cash. Are we allowed to transfer that into food or assets? So there's quite a lot of context-specific factors you have to take into consideration before you can just say, okay, well, cash first. We know that through the Grand Bargain and lots of other commitments, we have a cash first kind of global consensus. And, you know, of course, I'd pretty much agree with that. But, and we should go into situations going, yes, we should give cash first if there's no obvious reason not to give it. But there might be obvious reasons not to give cash. It might be issues around transparency, budgets, all kinds of risk around fiduciary risk. So you might actually have to choose a different modality. Or you might have a mixed modality. So the second point we talk about is setting transfer values. So if you think about transfers provided in a chronic, long-term, vulnerable situation, say in Ethiopia, Productive Safety Net provides 8 million people transfers. And the time frame of that support is a seasonal safety net. It's about 9 months. people get that support. When you have a shock, an acute shock happening, humanitarian support comes in, and the time frame of that is very different. It could be 1 month, it could be 3 months. It's entirely different, and the principles of delivering it, even targeting, are different. And that creates a non-equivalence in the value that is given to people. So people are sitting on the ground. Some people are chronic. They've been designated as chronically poor. Others have got this acute poverty. Like Rachel was saying, some of the people who are on the program also have an acute problem that's compounded. And we've got long-term productive safety net support in cash, and then we've got humanitarian food coming in. And typically, when you look at the countries I work in East Africa, the value of the food can be up to 4 times higher than the value of the cash that people are getting. And, you know, you might say, well, that's okay, they're only getting it for 2 months. But it's actually not okay for people on the ground who actually see, oh, that's a huge difference, and it can create social tension. Not only that, in qualitative work I've done, you see that people who are on long-term social protection support, they know kind of a drought's coming, a shock's coming, and they'll actually deliberately say, actually, I'd like to go off the productive safety net, because they know they'll get onto the humanitarian support and they'll get 4 times the amount, and they won't have to do public works for it. So there's all kinds of equivalence issues that when you come in and you try and coordinate these benefits, that you need to think quite carefully about. I'm happy to talk about this afterwards, obviously. So the third point that we raise is around thinking about how the type of benefit you are going to provide links to the type of shocks that you might expect to come. And so the appropriate modality will be linked to the shock. So it links to the first point, actually. So if you've got a fast onset shock that wipes out all your assets and your markets and your livestock, you might think, well, maybe we need food in this, or livestock, or we need to restock assets in this context. Or perhaps you'll think, well, there's a slow onset seasonal drought shock coming. We've got time to pre-register, like in the Hunger Safety Net program in Kenya, they pre-register those that are very likely to become vulnerable. And so as soon as that drought happens, or the trigger happens, you can actually deliver through e-payments to all those pre-registered vulnerable people, right? It's a very different type of mechanism, but it all had to be set up in advance through the banking system and the big targeting efforts that go on. Okay, so the next point that we talk about relates to the system maturity, social protection system maturity, that I've already alluded to earlier. And it's essentially the ability to be shock responsive is going to depend on what system you've already got in place, and depends where you're working, of course. Something I was going to raise in response to Rachel's presentation, but I didn't get the chance. I did have my hand up. Was that we often, so I've done some work in Malawi a couple of years ago, where I was asked to come and talk about shock responsive social protection and how we build shock response. But it was quite clear, talking to the donors and myself, that just the social protection system itself was not working well. It wasn't covering the majority of people who had needs. So the exclusion that Rach was talking about and going, oh, if we've got shock responsive, we're going to have exclusion. Well, even without shock responsive, you've got massive exclusion by design. It's not because we've implemented that, but we haven't got money. And the need is so vast that we have to expect there's going to be exclusion. There was exclusion even without the shock responsive part. So there's an issue of, I think you were saying, that the cart before the horse. Like, is it okay to build shock response into a social protection system when the social protection system is not yet properly working or properly financed? Or should there be parallel efforts? So that's a discussion point, I think. Okay, another point that we raised is around coordination. I think Rachel's presentation went over this much better than I will, but we talk about it in relation to the benefit modalities in the paper. And again, we talk a little bit about these siloed organizations. both from the donor perspective, but also from government in terms of disaster risk management versus social protection types of ministries. And the type of funds or food that they might have available to them means that they can't necessarily harmonize benefit modalities. They might be able to harmonize the efforts and the targeting, but they might not be able to harmonize the modality itself. And then finally, we talk about approaches to deliver modalities within comprehensive programming. So we talk about graduation type models, graduation, cash plus, productive inclusion. All these terms cover similar types of comprehensive programming. So we can think of, for people who I'm sure everyone here knows, but a graduation program would be, say, a program that says, okay, we have a cash transfer or food transfer as a core element of this program, but that in itself is not going to help people get out of poverty. We need a bit of training, we need some credit provision, we need perhaps some ECD, perhaps we need some nutrition, and all of those together will help people graduate off the program and out of poverty. So graduation programs or cash plus programs in themselves are not modalities. They use different modalities, and they might have multiple modalities within the same package. So we talk about that, and also the complications of putting comprehensive programs within fragile settings, particularly if you've got deficits in institutions, deficits in democracy, deficits in all kinds of things. It's very hard to think about comprehensive programming. Okay. So I'm not going to go through all these, but we do go through these in the paper because we've drawn on all the great case studies that were provided for us and some others. But we try to emphasize different interesting, innovative practices from current programs that have been reviewed and current initiatives. Like I've already said, in Kenya, I'll just point out a couple of them, the Hunger Safety Net program, I think you could probably talk better about this, Rick, has done pretty well in the 4 sort of districts in the north of pre-registering people who are likely to be vulnerable should a vulnerability trigger go off in terms of rainfall, I think it is, or it's crop insurance or something, crop vegetation index. So if that trigger goes off, these people automatically get sent cash through mobile money. And that has worked pretty well. I don't know if it's worked well this year, but the years I looked at it, it was working very well, and people got paid very quickly. The payout happened very quickly after the shock trigger went off. And also because it was known to be a short-term thing, it was easy to then sort of turn it off once that drought or that period was over. So the Productive Safety Net program, which I'm very familiar with, I've been evaluating it for about 12 years.
5 minutes.
Okay. So that has got some really interesting ways of thinking about modalities. At sort of the local levels, people and the local officials are able to say, well, actually, this year we'd like to have cash, or we'd like to have a mixture of food and cash. And so that's been really interesting to see, particularly in the context in 2008, there was a big food price inflation in Ethiopia. And it was clear that obviously the cash value was eroded. People couldn't buy food, and they wanted to switch straight into food. They couldn't switch immediately, but within the next season they were able to switch into getting food. And the Productive Safety Net's also got, and it's evolved, it had risk financing function, it has got contingency funds that are held at the federal level and at the local district level, which have different rules around the use of, but at the very local level, if you have a sort of quite a small scale idiosyncratic shock, then you're allowed to use that to cover nutrition support, or if somebody in the household has died, you can pay out top-up support, or if there's been a localized flood. But then the federal level, if there's a widespread emergency, there's contingency funds that are used, and extra cash can be put through the contingency funds, and that uses the entire national system to deliver support. But of course, there's a huge undercoverage problem, as I was talking about earlier. So other examples here that you can look at in the paper. And the last slide, we did our best to come up with some recommendations for how you would think about operationalizing this sort of benefit modality concerns within this nexus, within sort of a fragile context, humanitarian context. And some of them have already been covered by Rachel, particularly the political economy considerations. The institutional silos, I've come across this a lot. I've worked, as I said, mainly in East Africa. I've been working in Ethiopia, in Kenya, Malawi, and I've even been working a lot in Rome with FAO and WFP, and it's very clear that institutional silos, they are breaking down and things are getting much better, but some of the culture around where things should sit and what type of modality people should use really creates a problem for trying to work together and trying to harmonize across these different aspects.
2 minutes.
Okay. I think I'm just going to pick a couple of these. So this fourth one down, viewing vulnerability through the lens of seasonality. This is something that came up quite strongly in some of the case studies, but also in my own work and some of Daniel's work. Daniel used to work for WFP in Malawi for many years. And the fact that modality type, if you think about cash, food, assets, let's just put those three for now. Usually we go in and say, okay, well, at the moment we're all saying cash first, and it used to be food. But when you actually go and ask people on the ground what they would like to be given, as I said, it depends very much on context, but it also depends on seasonal adjustments they have to make. If possible, you could actually give food at one point of the year, assets at another point of the year, and cash at another point of the year, depending on what the food markets and what their production looks like. Of course, when we're working at a national level, that's very hard to do. You can't chop and change so quickly. But it's really important to think about how your benefit modalities, you might want a mixed modality, given the seasonal constraints people have in food markets, and particularly even in input markets, they might need an input package, if you think of all the fertilizer types of subsidies and the seed subsidies. So these are just some considerations. I think it'd be great to talk about them, because it's not that we've got all the answers. Yeah, that's it.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm sure that's provoked some questions or points of clarification requests from the audience. We have 5 minutes for that. Do we have any questions or comments? 1, 2. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. My name is Catalina Gomez, and I am from UNICEF in Mexico. Just wanted to push you a little bit on something that I found very interesting, and if you can reflect a little bit further about the need to have shock-responsive social protection, even though if you don't have a fully established social protection. I think that somehow we're seeing this a lot in Latin America, where there's a lot of issues in not being able to reach migrant population, etc. But because there's always this issue of like who goes first, the nationals, the locals, or the migrants, that we're seeing huge floods of population in Mexico, in Colombia, in Ecuador. So this is not only in one country, but in the Latin American context, we're seeing this quite often. And also I had a question about the delivery modalities and how to communicate these to beneficiaries. You were mentioning all these examples mostly from Africa about how the programs were expanded, but how did the population perceive that they were beneficiaries of an X program and now some others were benefiting from the other ones? Are there interesting experiences that allowed the managers of these programs to communicate the different situation? And what about the expectations and raised expectations about the delivery of each program. Thanks.
Thank you. And there's a gentleman just behind you who has a question.
Thank you. I'm Andrea from UNICEF, Bangkok, Asia Pacific office. In the region, we start thinking about, when we talk about shock response to social protection, the idea of complementarity or delegation, in the sense that there's a difference between thinking social protection system as one of the possible deliverers, like the operational to provide a function that is reacting to a shock, or thinking about that reacting to a shock is the major activity of social protection system. And if it's the second one, the idea is always to identify rules where if a system is weak or not able, or actually is affected by the shock, delegate the roles to other agents. But what is important is it's clear what is the responsibility and what are the linkages on the activity. It's the reverse of subsidiarity in a way. So the idea is that it's done by central level, unless the central level is not able to do it, and in that case delegate the NGO, the international community, and etc. But create that linkages in terms of responsibility, and not just treating the social protection system as one of the possible service delivery. Is more to have that kind of clarity, because that is where we have more engagement with the government and say, is your responsibility to react on this kind of shock? And the other one is also being careful that depends on which shock we are talking about. So like conflict and that kind of issues, then we have the problem of neutrality and we have the usual humanitarian problems or issues, while on other kind of shocks, such as natural shocks, earthquake, and etc., is a different one. You don't have a challenge of the institution.
Thank you. The gentleman there.
Good afternoon. My name is Thomas Kangatona. I work for AIM, the International Association of Mutual Benefit Societies. I just have one question. I'm quite new to this field and this nexus. I just want to know, did you see in your work actually, did you encounter or have worked with voluntary healthcare insurance schemes, and in what ways did you see any potential with them? Or not, because we have members in Latin America, for instance in Colombia, that work also in crisis situations, and I haven't quite seen them so far in your presentation, or in a presentation so far. So I just want to know. I mean, yes, do you work with them, with us?
Good, thank you. Well, if that's it, or another question? No, one more. Okay, that's it.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Saman Thapa. I'm from UNICEF Myanmar. Just a question. I think in both presentations we saw this sort of tension coming between the need to have a systems-driven approach, more focus on government ownership, etc., from the social protection side, and then at the same time having this concern about sort of humanitarian programming taking over social cash transfer programming and humanitarian response, and how to navigate that. Most of the examples focused on sudden onset crises and disasters, right? So this concern is particularly pronounced. Would the answer in response to should we invest in systems ex post or ex ante be different if we're talking increasingly about protracted crisis, like in the case of Myanmar or in MENA countries, where, do we even have the option of thinking about ex post or ex ante when it comes to systems building?
Okay, thank you. That's certainly a lot to go on. Have you got all of those questions? I'm sure you can.
I've got them all. I don't know if I'm going to have to answer them all.
Okay.
But I'll do my best.
Have a go.
Okay. So I think that the first one's about shock responsive social protection. How do we talk about it when we don't have a fully established social protection system? I think we can talk about it because there's many parts. If they're separate, if you've got the disaster response and the social protection long-term response, there's a lot of functions they do that overlap, like the vulnerability mapping, targeting, although I have to say where I work, humanitarians don't keep good lists very well in terms of who they've targeted. So there's a lot of harmonization that could happen just across those specific technical things. But I guess what worries me is that often you find that there's a lot of emphasis on building shock responsive social protection systems, and it's almost like we're setting ourselves up for a fall, because people go, oh, it didn't work, there was all this exclusion. It's like, well, There was tons of exclusion way before that happened. We never covered. The need is so big in some of these countries. So I just think we need to be realistic about the coverage issue. The issue you're also talking about around forcibly displaced. And so I do some work on forcibly displaced populations and social protection. And the same issue is there's a lot of criticism because some countries, they can't cater for their forcibly displaced who have arrived, refugees. And you're like, well, no, but they can't cater for their own population either. So who's going to take priority if they've got the budget? It's definitely not going to be the forcibly displaced. So obviously there's a place for external agencies to come in. It's kind of the same sort of argument. How do beneficiaries perceive these different modalities? Well, all I know is from the programs I've worked on, unfortunately, the benefits are often seen as gifts rather than rights. And so they're just happy to get what they can get, which is a bit sad because a lot of these programs are billed as entitlements and rights and this, but in fact, when push comes to shove, it's pretty much seen as a gift and a sort of top-down handout. So frequently, not always, beneficiaries are just happy to get what they can. But if you actually ask them, would you prefer food or cash or asset, then they typically will state a preference, depending on where they are in the country or whether they're in a zone without much food or without many markets. What was I going to say, David?
The mutual, the voluntary health.
Oh, yeah, we have not covered voluntary health insurance or community-based health insurance. I work on it a little bit, but we haven't covered it here, mainly because there's a bit of a discussion about whether that is part of a social protection system. It's relatively straightforward to define it like that, but on the ground, it often sits outside a social protection sector. It sits within Ministry of Health or it sits somewhere else. But I don't know, other people might have something to add on that. So I've looked at it, but it typically is not within social protection strategies or programs that I've been involved with. But does anyone want to add to that? I don't know. So that's not very helpful, sorry. But it's not covered, and it didn't come up as a modality because the modality, and also because it's usually contributory of some level. And we just looked at the non-contributory types. Responsibilities. Say that, can you just?
What are the responsibilities? Like, is it worth deciding who does what and who is ultimately responsible?
Yeah.
In the case where there are limited capacities.
That's what Andrea was saying.
Yes.
My view is that, sometimes the central level, the government, is not going to be able to cope with whatever. If you've got a really huge fast onset shock, like a tsunami or something, and we may not have put in sort of we may not have planned it in advance, we may not have our systems capable. And so there's always going to be a case for quite a standard humanitarian response, for me. I don't know if that'll go down well because everyone's desperate to merge everything into one thing. But for me, I think whether it's to do with the nature of the shock, and it's totally unanticipated, and we haven't in any way thought that this might happen to us, or because the governments we're working with, for some reason, we can't possibly rely on them, then I think there'll always be a case to say, actually, we're going to have to delegate responsibility for this to whether it's a pure humanitarian function or some other function. I don't know if that gets where you're coming from, but you'll have to talk to me in the break otherwise. I think was that it? Or
yes, I mean,
tension between system-driven approach versus humanitarian. That's it. There is a tension.
And the different types of shock. I think you've covered that as well, protracted and so on. So I think that is probably where we will end it for the moment, and I suggest we go for coffee, stretch our legs, and then we'll come back and pick up thereafter. In what's the time? It's 10 past. If we have a 15-minute break and we're back here at 4:15, that would be great. Thanks.